Welcome to the Your Innovation Coach webinar. Today's topic is competitive strategy, and in particular, I want to talk about avoiding a war of attrition. To get started, I want to start with a story from my industrial career. I used to work for a company called TA Instruments that manufactures analytical instruments. On this diagram are pictures of various instruments, a particular class of instrument, and how they changed over time, both in terms of their from a functional standpoint as well as the price that we charge to customers. So that's the solid black line. The dashed line is just my qualitative assessment of whether we were meeting the customer need at that price point, we were below that point, or we were overreaching, charging too much at a particular for a particular performance. So this instrument came out in the 80s, top line type of instrument, sold typically for 25 to 30,000. This instrument came out in the 1990s, marginal improvement, maybe a couple 3x improvement in performance. List price on a high-end system was probably at that point around 40,000. In the 2000, this instrument came out. It was a pretty marked change, a new platform, amount and order of magnitude at least greater performance, and subsequently the price that we charged to customers broke through around $75,000 to $80,000 for a top-end system. As a side note, it's interesting because the reality is that we never really knew whether customers would pay that much for the technology, and to some degree we got lucky. It was well regarded. It fit a real need in the market, and we were able to justify the price. In the 2010s, we built on that legacy with a new platform, but it was only maybe 2 or 3x times the improvement over the previous platform. Same basic technology, a lot of new software enhancements and so forth. But the reality is that the price point went up to around 90 to 100,000 for a top-end instrument, and at that point we were overreaching the market. Basically, customers were not willing to pay that amount of money for the improvement in that performance. And subsequent to that, another platform came out that reduced the cost structure of that system, got it back more in line. The point is of this story is that in our quest to compete with competitors, to out innovate competitors, we get so focused on that sometimes we lose sight of why customers purchase in the first place, and we can overreach the market. A second example is illustrated by this picture, and this is true in a lot of industries. If you look all around you, whether it's in the tool industry like this, or hotels, or airlines, or computers, or phones, you will see that in many cases companies compete with each other with very similar products, and I think it's a really common situation. Again, in our quest to outcompete competitors, you know, every industry or many industries end up with a whole group of competitors that are duking it out, so to speak, for market share with very, very similar products. So the result is we end up, in that case, in this war of attrition, battling it out with our competition with very similar products. And the bottom line is all industries tend over time to become a commodity market. And in that case, profits go down for all and no one really wins. And the bottom line is if you are falling into this concept of a war of attrition by default, then it really is evidence of a lack of strategy. This illustrates the point in the solar industry. It's typical of many industries. The time frame may be different, but the cost structure, the pricing goes down, the volumes go up. It's typically out in this area where the competitors duke it out for market share, and margins over time continue to go down. Or secondly, we overreach the market, as in the first example, by paying more attention to the competition and not really understanding what the customer values. we can overreach the market. Today we're mostly going to be focusing on this concept of a war of attrition and how to prevent it. And at this point, a military analogy is worthwhile here. Attrition warfare in the military sense is a strategy where the belligerents basically throw resources at each other and try to get the other party to collapse. This type of a war is usually won by the side with greater resources. So of course, classic here, World War I was an example of that type of attrition warfare. In the context of business, this is where you end up competing with the incumbents in the market for market share for virtually identical products. So there is an alternative. And again, if we look at a military analogy, maneuver warfare is a military strategy that advocates not a head-to-head competition with the enemy, but by more emphasis on speed and stealth and agility. So for instance, this graphic over here is actually one of Napoleon's favorite strategic maneuvers. So rather than going head-to-head with the competition or the enemy in this case, you try to outflank them by thinking through the process, trying to maneuver through agility and speed. So in the business context, the emphasis is on speed, stealth, insight, and innovation to win a market position at the least costs and trying to avoid the head-to-head competition. So what we're going to be talking about today is this concept of a maneuver strategy. And there are three individual sub-strategies that make that up. The preferable one is what's called preemption. That's where you take valuable unoccupied space before a competitor even realizes it or acknowledges it. This is akin to the blue ocean strategy, if you've heard of that before. So that's the best strategy. The second best is if you're forced to compete in a particular market segment with a customer or with a competitor that's already there, then you attempt to try to find weaknesses and dislocate that competitor in order to get them to change, either vacate or rethink their strategy in that particular market segment. And if those two don't work, then the last resort is disruption. This is where you're in a market space with another competitor, and you really can't find any weaknesses that you can attack, so you're left with basically trying to disrupt them, making their life as miserable as possible. Though at the end, you're never going to really eliminate that competitor. You're just going to try to do the best that you can with the situation. There are three levels you can operate on when you're working with this type of a strategy. You can be at the strategic level. In other words, you can think about your entire industry in general, or you can be more at the operational level, maybe in a particular market geography, or, for instance, or very tactical. It could be a very specific product for a very particular market segment. So you need to think that through because it will determine the resources that are going to be required, the risks associated with it, as well as the time frame. Intel is a good example of a company that uses all three levels. The partnership they have with Microsoft is strategic in nature, but they do things very well at the operational and the tactical level in terms of being able to come to market much faster than competitors with new products. The Intel Inside concept is a good psychological tactic in terms of putting fear into the mind of consumers in terms of inferior products. So it's an example of someone that operates at all three levels. This whole strategy is much more challenging than falling into this war of attrition. That's the easy strategy, and almost by default sometimes we end up there. But to think through these three different strategies takes a lot more foresight and thought. You need more information about the competition and their vulnerabilities, which helps as well in terms of you understanding how you might be vulnerable to attacks like this. And certainly it requires more understanding of your business model and your competitor's business model. So this ties in very well to the webinar last month on business model innovation. I'll come back to that in a minute. The other point I would make is I think this is not an all or nothing proposition. I think you could be, especially if you're working at a tactical level, you might be using preemption in one particular segment, whereas you might be using dislocation in another market segment. So again, it's not an all or nothing proposition. It's going to be very context specific in terms of how you use the strategy. The resource tip here is this book, Outmaneuver. I know one of the authors, Jeffrey Phillips, who I work with on the Product Development Management Association. When I first read this book and was introduced to this concept of the maneuver strategy, it makes a lot of sense to me. It connected a lot of dots, so to speak, in terms of my industrial career, and I think you can benefit from this framework as well. It's a very useful framework, and much of what I'm going to talk about through the rest of the webinar comes from this concept laid out in this particular resource. So a good example of preemption is thinking about the automobile industry, and particularly Toyota versus GM. You know, Toyota came into the market actually back in 1959, and of course they were competing at that point with General Motors, the behemoth. They had something like 60% of the market. We're getting to the point where they really felt they understood what customers wanted, and they produced cars and put them into the market, assuming that customers would always buy their product. Over time, they emphasized less about quality and opened up the door to a competitor like Toyota. If you look at an expansion here of the advertisement, this seems pretty common now, but back in 1959 this was pretty radical in the sense that, you know, the emphasis here was on expense to maintain and operate. So fuel economy for the first time was being emphasized. Quality certainly was a big area of this at the price point that they were charging. So this is kind of a classic example of preemption where Toyota carved out a space where there was no competition. GM was in a much different spot, really disregarded this type of a market segment. Toyota was able to come in, leverage some of the advantages that they had in order to carve out a space where a competitor did not exist at that particular point. Of course, you know the rest of the story. This is an example from my experience of dislocation. Calmetrics is an instrument company that that's a client of mine, versus TA Instruments. This is the company that I previously worked for in the instrument business. TA is a much bigger company, at least you know, an order of magnitude bigger than Calmetrics. They're a very big company with a lot of different product offerings, but in this particular market segment, they have two specific instruments that they supply. Calmetrics, in choosing a competitive strategy, did not choose to take on the competition head for head with like-for-like products. They targeted a very specific part of the industry. It happens to be the cement and concrete industry. TA views themselves really as a high-end supplier to all types of segments. They don't really focus on one particular market segment. Calmetrics chose a strategy where they came in at the lower end of the market. About 75% of the TA price point. TA definitely views themselves as a high-end supplier, and so typically disregards that part of the market. It's just, in that particular market segment, it's just not that important to them. In addition, the Calmetrics strategy based, you know, which informed their product development, was to create a system that they could ship and could be self-installed and much simpler to use for the customer, versus TA by default has a large established service organization and basically ingrained in their culture when they design instrumentation is to design it such that the service organization installs it. So a much different way to approach the installation, which obviously affects the price that can be charged to the customer. The fact is the instrument is more robust and really more aligned to what the customer values in this particular market segment. TA's design philosophy is certainly a much more refined, much more elegant design, but that really does not match up well with what the customer values in that particular market segment. And finally, just by how Calmetrics is organized, and even related to the fact that it's self-installed and they don't have to have a large infrastructure of field service folks, they have much lower overhead, which also supports the price point, versus TA, which has much higher overhead, much higher margin requirements. So, you know, all of these things kind of work together, and rather than attacking TA head-on with a very similar business model, it really was a new business model, and so it's a good example of a dislocation strategy, and we'll come back to that in a bit. I mentioned a few slides ago that this whole concept of the maneuver strategy really relates well to the conversation that we had last month concerning the business model canvas, which is a great way to understand your business model, your competitor's business model, and envision new business models. And really what we're talking about in the maneuver strategy requires a good understanding of business models. And in order to really implement that strategy, this is a perfect tool, a perfect complementary tool in order to carve out, particularly when you're looking at preemption in terms of unoccupied space by a competitor. So much of that is not related to the product, but much more so related to all the aspects of the actual business model itself. All right, so let's start with preemption. That's, as I mentioned, the gold standard, the best strategy to use. And when you're looking for unoccupied space, there are at least three possibilities. One, overlooked market segments or channels. The example of Toyota versus GM is an example of that, where that low-end market, so to speak, that emphasized fuel efficiency, economy, lower price points, and so forth, that was a market segment that GM just wasn't paying any attention to. You know, they believed they knew what customers wanted and what they were going to buy, and ignored that particular segment of the market. Another possibility is positions adjacent to an industry. An example there is how Uber looked at the market and really the existing taxis and private car services and so forth. The other options that customers have are really adjacent types of segments, not direct competitors per se to Uber. So again, Uber carved out, you know, it was a preemption type of strategy. It wasn't competing head-to-head with taxis. It wasn't just creating a new taxi service and competing in those markets. It was creating a whole new business model that's adjacent to the existing competitive options. And then third is maybe emerging positions not readily recognized by others. You know, Apple continues to do this very well in terms of creating business models, creating products and services that we didn't even know that we needed. So these are really based on emerging positions that are not recognized by others. Now, inherent in the whole concept of preemption are a couple key concepts. One is that you act before a competitor actually realizes it, or alternatively will admit the significance of the move. I mean, the bottom line, existing companies are very loath to change their mental models of the world, and you know, this is where preemption is really a disruptive type of move by a competitor, and this illustrates in the book publishing world where Amazon came in. Their revenue grew very, very rapidly at the expense of the brick and mortar traditional bookstores, the Barnes and Nobles and the Borders of the world. And as I mentioned, existing companies are very can be disrupted in this way very easily because the mental models just don't shift fast enough. In the case of Barnes & Noble, they were able to shift. They're still in business today. If you go into a Barnes & Noble store today versus back in 05 and 06, they look very differently. You'll notice now those stores probably half the space is not books at all. So they've really actually de-emphasized, in my opinion, the books in terms of their stores. Of course, they also came out with the Nook to compete with the e-readers. So they were able to adapt and change and still exist. Borders around 2010 actually went out of business. It's interesting to note that I saw just recently where Amazon, I think, is considering some brick and mortar stores. So things change rapidly in many different markets. So taking unoccupied space from a competitor usually means they're either ignoring it or it's based on some emerging trends that are generally not recognized. And a key insight here, and I'll repeat it often through this webinar, is this use of the business model canvas can pay really big dividends when you're trying to implement this type of a strategy. It really helps inform your actions, particularly as it relates to preemption. That, in combination with competitive knowledge and scanning the environment, are really the key things for making this strategy work. The second concept, kind of caught up in the whole idea of preemption, is that it prevents an effective competitive response. You've probably all seen the movie The 300, which recounts the famous battle where Leonidas and the Spartans preempted the Persian army by taking very valuable strategic land and forcing the Persians into a very narrow canyon and to fight how the Greeks wanted them to fight. And really the Persians had no choice but to fight on their terms. They could either do that or go back. And of course the Greeks knew long term they were never going to beat the Persians. But it was really more of a strategic decision in order to give the Greek city-states time to coalesce around the need to defeat the Persians the following year. So it's a good example of how preemption really forces the hand of the competitor, and you're trying to get them to compete on your terms. Again, this whole concept of preemption really relates well to the concept of the business model canvas and finding new ways to deliver on your value proposition, particularly in terms of preempting competition. Secondly, I'll reiterate the fact that preemption is the best strategy if you can make it work. Third is that, in my opinion, it doesn't mean that you won't have any Me Too products in particular market segments. The issue really becomes if that's your dominant strategy and it's just by happenstance that you're making those decisions, then that's the mistake that you can make. But it certainly does not mean that in all market segments that you're serving you might not have some Me Too products in order to just be in that market space. And finally, the last comment is that preemption is different than first mover. First mover can be very advantageous, but if you cannot structure barriers of entry for a competitor to come in and copy you, then first mover doesn't mean anything. So preemption is more about, in addition to being in a space before somebody else, it's about erecting barriers of entry and the way that that you craft your position so that you can protect that space as much as possible. It's not entirely, out of the question that you'll be entirely successful at that, but that's the intent, is to try to erect some barriers of entry, particularly as it relates to your culture, your management model, things that cannot as easily be copied. Products and services can be copied pretty easily, but a unique business model in terms of how you put things together and the processes that you use and so forth, that's what that often can create a more sustainable competitive barriers of entry. And there are lots of examples where the first mover did not win in the long term. MySpace versus Facebook, Napster versus iTunes, BlackBerry versus iPhone. The list goes on and on. So to conclude this discussion on preemption, there are some key things that have to be in place. Obviously, you have to do pretty good at competitive analysis, understanding the competition, and not only the direct competition, but looking at adjacent competitors, you know, what you might not consider normal competitors. And then third, the concept of market intelligence. Where is your market going? What are the big trends that could affect you? And then finally, this, you know, mastering the use of the business model and the value proposition canvas, I think are key tools to help implement the strategy. Okay, so if you cannot carve out, you know, space that a competitor does not exist at this point, and you want to compete in a market segment where there is already a customer, then the second best option is dislocation. This is where you're going into a market segment that there's a competitor that already exists. Now you're trying to find weaknesses in that with that competitor or competitors in order to disrupt them and dislocate them in order to compete and get them to change their strategy in that particular market segment. So there are some key things that are part of this. It's an indirect attack on an incumbent. You're forcing them to compete with less than full capabilities. You've got several tactics. We're going to talk about those here in a minute that you can use, and these also apply to disruption as well. And the bottom line is, this is when you have a competitor that's in a space that you want to be, and you're trying to find some weaknesses to attack it. And this is much better. Attacking a competitor this way is much better than, you know, just falling into this war of attrition trap. You know, it really more focuses, it's more strategic in nature in terms of you're trying to craft a strategy or a business model in order to take advantage of the weaknesses that you might identify with a competitor. So it's much different. And again, understanding business models and so forth, I think, is a key factor in this exercise and this particular strategy as well. So let's talk about the tactics. A positional can be threefold. It can be physical position. So if you're in a B2B world, it could be the distribution chain. If you're in a retail world, it could be your brick and mortar stores. It could be virtual. An example like Amazon online versus brick and mortar stores. Again, today with the internet, that's a substantial opportunity for many industries. And third, it could be even in the mental sense, how people feel about your company. You know, this concept of the triple bottom line is gaining a lot more credence. The fact that it's not just about making money in a business. There are other things that are important, like environmental consciousness and the effect on society and so on and so forth. So you might be able to use that as a positioning strategy. So it's positional in that sense in terms of how people feel about your company. Functional is probably the most common, most easy to understand, but it's not always about your functional, tangible product. It could be a customer experience type of situation, or a process, internal process. You know, in the case of Calmetrics versus TA, the fact that it was a simpler to use and install system is certainly a functional tactic. The fact that it's more robust for the types of labs that the instrument was going into is a functional tactic. The breadth of the product line, Calmetrics had a much broader product line than the two instruments that TA manufactures. That's a functional type of tactic. And the third most important, or third one, is temporal. This relates to speed or pace. And that can either be mounting tempo, which means it has to do with your decision making. We've talked a lot in these webinars about the decision making processes, and you know, if you can move faster, make decisions faster by how you organize yourselves and how you approach new product development, for instance, that can be a big advantage, and it can be an important temporal tactic. Or it could relate to execution speed. How good are you at project management? We've talked a lot about that as well in these webinars. So the faster you can get to market by how you approach new product development could be an important temporal tactic. How fast you can deliver a product to market. When I worked at the company TA Instruments, we used that very effectively. We were able to, by how we designed the manufacturing process, able to ship a product within 2 or 3 days sometimes from an order, versus the norm in the industry was 4 to 6 weeks. That was a very great tactical advantage in competing. And so those are just examples of temporal type of tactics. The last two are really more secondary and are really meant to be force multipliers with the first three. One is psychological. This is where you use fear or risk avoidance or panic or distraction, and you can either target investors, customers, or employees. It could either be positive to your company or negative against the competition. You can use things like customer surveys with quality data, for instance, third-party survey data, might be an example of that. I'll come back here in a minute and give you some examples of psychological tactics and temporal tactics with real companies. And the final one is informational, using information through maybe better IT systems or big data and so forth. Teva is a generic pharmaceutical company, is a good example of how they pioneered the use of patent data mining to identify drugs that were coming off of patent and developing them just in the time for when the patent expired. So let's talk about some examples. T-Form is a company based near Greenville, South Carolina that I'm familiar with. They have disrupted the custom thermoform packaging business. And in that business, traditional suppliers for this type of custom packaging, it would take a long time in terms of how long it takes to get the product, the costs associated with getting to that product. T-Form came in and really based on the some functional tactics related to the process that they developed, how they manufacture and sell the molds, how they approach the quoting process. Really was an end-to-end solution in terms of reducing time and costs to the end user to get custom thermoform packaging. So basically it's a good example of using both temporal tactics and functional tactics in order to disrupt an industry that was kind of used to doing things in a similar way. So it was really all about process improvements. It really has nothing to do with the type of product that the customer is getting. It all has to do with the process. And so it's just a classic case of dislocation, through a better business model, looking at the weaknesses of the existing competitors and finding the tactics to dislocate them and create a really unique business model that is allowing this company to grow rapidly. Another example is, you may have seen these advertisements. I always get a kick out of them just because the spokesman, who I think is the CEO, is not your typical spokesman, and I guess that's the point. But this is an example of using both functional and psychological tactics. They tout the independent studies of how good their product is versus competitive products in terms of finding viruses and preventing malware and ransomware and so forth. So it is a functional type of argument, but they're using psychological, they're using the fear of getting a virus on your computer as one aspect of that psychological tactic. And a second psychological tactic is they really build up this concept of made in America. They're implying that somehow it's better without actually saying anything about that, but they're certainly playing to patriotism here in the U.S. As a psychological tactic, as a way to position themselves against all the other quote-unquote foreign manufactured products. And the final example is also amusing in some sense. This is from Southwest back in the early 90s. They created this concept of the Triple Crown Award. And it was based on real DOT data where they, by looking at that data, found that they were #1 in customer satisfaction, on-time performance, baggage handling. So they created this Triple Crown Award and awarded it to themselves. And so as a psychological tactic, actually most customers didn't even realize this was a made-up award that Southwest made up and gave themselves. But another example of a psychological tactic in positioning. So if you can't do preemption, the first alternative. Second alternative is then you're looking at dislocation. If you can't do that, you can't find any weaknesses with the competitor in that particular market segment, then you're really left with disruption. At least it's a little more strategic than just an all-out head-to-head competition. You're trying to distract the competitor from efficient operation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, since it's the least valuable of the 3 techniques. You can use the same 3 tactics as we described before. As an overview in terms of implementing this strategy, step #1 is gathering the market and competitive intelligence in order to implement it. And again, the use of the business model canvas fits perfectly well into that whole first burger dot there, in terms of understanding your business model, competitors' business models, and using it as important input to this strategy. Second, you'll then have to decide the level of attack. Are you looking at this from your entire industry standpoint? Is it more operational, maybe in one particular geography? Or is it really more tactical for a very particular product, for a very particular market segment? So it's important to think this through, when you're working through this strategy. Third, then, you try to find first some unoccupied space that you can preempt the competition. That's really the first choice. If you can't do that, then you're going to really need to do a little bit more work related to the competitor, because by default you now have decided that you've got to compete with somebody that's in a particular market segment that you want to be in. So you really need to understand the competitor, and the first thing to do is to look at it along 4 dimensions. One are the strategies. This really defines what are they really hoping to achieve and how are they positioned, and not as much what they say, but how they're investing their resources. Companies say a lot of things, particularly in their advertisements, about what their strategies are, but the key will be how they're investing their resources. So that's the first dimension. Secondly is the tangible requirements. This is really the requirements that is necessary to compete in that particular market. In the case of an instrument company, you've got to be able to engineer a product. You have to, basically be able to manufacture it. You've got to be able to, how are you going to install it? So there's an installation process, so there's a training process, and then there's an ongoing customer support process in terms of application support. So those are kind of tangible requirements that everyone has to meet who's supplying instruments into a particular market segment. So all the players have to fulfill these. That doesn't mean everybody does them well. Some of them may do them differently or worse than other competitors, but everyone has to fulfill these in some fashion. Third are the intangibles, things like the brand, the culture, the reputation, your ability to differentiate from your competition. So those are the intangibles. And then finally, the last is the actual, out of that falls the products and the services that you actually bring to market. In the case of Calmetrics versus TA, certainly TA viewed themselves as a high-end type of supplier, whereas Calmetrics was able to look at the market a little bit differently and look at the low-end market as maybe more attractive. So that's an example of how that played out in that particular case. Tangible requirements, as I mentioned, for any instrument supplier, you have to be able to install the system, but the two different competitors, TA versus Calmetrics, looked at that very differently. TA had an established service organization, so they designed products around having their service organization install systems, versus Calmetrics took a different approach. So they both had to fulfill that tangible requirement, but the way that Calmetrics went about it in terms of designing a system that could be self-installed was a whole different way to approach that particular tangible requirement, and took a strength that TA had and turned it into a weakness in that particular case. And the brand, the whole issue with the brand is important there. TA certainly is a very well respected brand, and rather than arguing against that, Calmetrics actually uses it as to their advantage. They can point to customers that, TA, who pioneered a lot of this and spends much more heavily in marketing, provides justification to Calmetrics' customers that the technique is valid, the techniques are valid. So rather than trying to argue against that, actually Calmetrics leverages that and uses it to their advantage. So an interesting twist on thinking about the brand of your competitor. And then finally, the products and services. In the case of TA versus Calmetrics, Calmetrics used a tactic that a much broader product offering compared to the very narrow offering in that particular market segment of TA. So these are the kind of things that you'll go through to think about these four competitive dimensions, and then you need to define and prioritize those vulnerabilities. Where is the competitor vulnerable? In the case of TA, they were vulnerable from an installation standpoint. They were vulnerable because they were ignoring, to some degree, the low-end market. They were vulnerable because they had a very narrow offering in that particular segment. And there are some key things that you need to ask yourself when you're considering these vulnerabilities. What's the most vulnerable to attack? What's the easiest to attack? And which align to our strengths and capabilities? You want to be able to align those to your strengths and capabilities, and not do something that you're not going to be successful at. And there are some classic tools out there that you can use to help frame the questions, to help prioritize the vulnerabilities that you will discover through the process. So once you've done that, now you've got to decide, okay, are you going to use dislocation? You're going to choose dislocation if you have an opponent that you've identified some critical weaknesses that you feel you can attack successfully. So that's where you're going to use this strategy. But if you can't find those, if the competitor is doing all things pretty well, then you're only left, if you want to compete in that market, by choosing a disruption strategy. And again, that's different than an all-out war of attrition. It's a little more strategic in nature, but it's certainly the least valuable of the three different strategies. And then finally, you've got a range of tactics that you can use for either dislocation or disruption. So in summary, the question that you have to answer is your default competitive strategy actually leading you to this war of attrition? Are you simply focusing on the competition, trying to outcompete them with like-for-like products, and not thinking through exactly what the alternatives might be? Or secondly, are you focusing so much on the competition that you run the risk of overreaching the market need at a given price point, as one of the examples early on illustrated? So rather than this war of attrition, a maneuver strategy is much superior. The only caveat is if you are the king of the hill, so to speak, and you have a lot more resources, you could potentially win in the long term. You know, and another good example of that is from my experience at TA Instruments back in the 90s. A Japanese competitor came in and tried to compete head-to-head with TA Instruments. TA Instruments had much more greater resources, and ultimately the Japanese company failed. They did not understand the market well enough. They did not understand what they were going up against in terms of the competition, and they eventually withdrew after 5 years from that U.S. market. They lost money and couldn't penetrate that market. So you have to be careful. The war of attrition, in that case, they basically, that's exactly what they did. They were trying to compete head-to-head with the king of the hill, so to speak, and they lost. So it's an important point. By far the best maneuver strategy is preemption. In other words, finding unoccupied space, coming up with a unique business model, a unique set of products and services that you can occupy a unique position. And finally, the concept that the maneuver strategy and the business model canvas are very complementary to one another. You know, perfecting your use of the business model canvas will help you implement this strategy. I'd like to thank you for your participation, and look forward to the next webinar. Have a great day.